We are now going to have a virtual tour of my favorite museum in the world, the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum. How many of you have ever visited the museum? Oh, fantastic, a lot of you. Well, you're welcome back anytime. And for those of you who have not yet visited, we look forward to welcoming you in the future. The museum's been closed during the pandemic, but we'll definitely let you know when we're able to welcome you again. So I'm going to share my screen now. For those of you who are Rosicrucians, this is your museum. The museum is sponsored by members of the Rosicrucian Order. And today we're going to explore some of the history of the museum, as well as examining and exploring a few of the artifacts in the museum. The Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum was founded by H. Spencer Lewis, who was an American philosopher who also founded the Rosicrucian Order AMORC in 1915. And he did that in New York City. And then in 1927, H. Spencer Lewis moved the headquarters of the Rosicrucian Order to San Jose. And there were a number of reasons that he chose this location. There is connection in history with Rosicrucians and this part of California. Also, H. Spencer Lewis said that people in California were very open to new ideas and philosophy, and he thought it was important to have the headquarters of the order in California and in San Jose in particular, because of the cultural institutions and universities in the area. So again, in 1927, the headquarters of the Rosicrucian Order was moved to San Jose. Now, you may be wondering about the Rosicrucian connection with Egypt. Okay, now you know why the Rosicrucian Order was headquartered in San Jose, but why is there an Egyptian museum? In the ancient mystery schools of Egypt, they used symbolism for the mysteries. And there was a deity named Thoth, who you see on the right here, the ibis-headed deity, who was the keeper of the mysteries. He was the patron deity of scribes. It was believed when you would see the footprints of an ibis that these are hieroglyphs. So he was the inventor of hieroglyphs, and he was the initiator. So the ancient Egyptian tradition was symbolized by this deity Thoth, the keeper of the mysteries and the initiator. So the mystical work, the initiations, the meaning behind the symbolism are all symbolized by this character Thoth. Later, the Greeks embraced much of Egyptian tradition and culture, and they merged their deity Hermes with Thoth. So they merged the characteristics. And over the years, Hermes became more and more revered. And eventually he became known not just as Hermes, but as Hermes the 3 times greatest. And in Greek, this name is Hermes Trismegistus. And Hermes Trismegistus, this character, he symbolizes the ancient mysteries that were perpetuated over hundreds and then eventually thousands of years. Then in the 1600s, this character, Hermes Trismegistus, was transformed into a man named Christian Rosenkreutz. And he was introduced in the Rosicrucian manifestos published in the early 1600s. And in the first manifesto, the Fama Fraternitatis, it tells the story of a man who goes on a pilgrimage and he gets diverted and ends up not going where he had intended to go, but instead visiting different mystical places of the world where he was introduced to these ancient traditions. And this character became known as Christian Rosenkreuz. When he returned to Europe, the people there who were in power, the religious leaders and the scholars, they didn't want to hear about the wisdom that he brought, because that would mean that their wisdom and power would be brought into question. So Christian Rosenkreuz created a mystical society of philosophers, the Rosicrucian Order, that perpetuates this ancient wisdom. So this is the Rosicrucian connection with ancient Egypt. In the late 1920s, H. Spencer Lewis, again, the founder of the Rosicrucian Order AMORC, this was in its current cycle in 1915, he seated here in the front on the left, he organized a journey to Egypt with members from around the world, and the journey began in New York, and they took a steamship to Europe and visited many of the cultural capitals of Europe and spent time in Egypt, where they had initiations at different places in this mystical land. And that is a photo of the group with H. Spencer Lewis at the head there in front of the pyramid in Egypt. Around this time, H. Spencer Lewis acquired the very first artifact in the collection of the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum. And it's this little statue of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet. And it's probably about 8 inches tall. And he placed this artifact on his desk in San Jose. And when people would come into his office, they would ask, "What is that?" And he would explain that this is the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum. This was the power of his visualization and his ability to manifest. So from this very first artifact, which is called RC1, we number all of the artifacts in the museum and put an RC in front of it. From this first artifact came the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, which today houses the largest collection of authentic ancient Egyptian artifacts on display in Western North America. Soon afterwards, H. Spencer Lewis had a number of artifacts, so he put a cabinet in the hallway, and that little RC number 1 is up there on the shelf, and eventually the number of artifacts outgrew the space that he had. So H. Spencer Lewis built this building, the Rosicrucian Egyptian Oriental Museum. And here's another shot of that museum. And this museum served for many, many years until, again, the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum's collection outgrew that space. Now, in 1939, H. Spencer Lewis passed on. He went through transition, and his son succeeded him as the imperator of the Rosicrucian Order, of this philosophical organization. And his son is Ralph Lewis, seen here. And Ralph Lewis was a great philosopher and humanitarian, and he was a very adventurous person. So he gathered together the Rosicrucian exploration group that went to Egypt and chose different areas in order to model the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose on. And here is part of his team. This was his nephew, Johnny Mee, who was an artist and was creating some of the artwork, which would then become the reliefs on the building. And here is a team that's building the tomb. And this is what the tomb looks like today. So that group that went to Egypt in the early 1960s came back and created this museum. And in 1966, the current building of the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum was dedicated. This is Ralph Lewis on the right, and he is with the mayor of San Jose there. So this is our beautiful museum today, and it is modeled after the Temple of Amun at Karnak. And Rosicrucian Park is a square block in San Jose, and most of the buildings are of Neo-Egyptian style. So they're modern buildings modeled on ancient Egyptian buildings. Now, today our focus at the museum is on collaboration and technology. And this is a photo of one of our artifacts, a mummy that received CT scanning. And we worked with Stanford University Hospital and NASA Biocomputational Lab and Volume Graphics that does simulations and other tech companies. And we did a CT scan of this child mummy. She was in that original case. She was one of the very first artifacts in the museum collection, but we knew nothing about her except that she was a child. The x-rays showed that her foot looked a little bit misshapen, so we thought maybe she had some kind of a physical issue. But with the CT scanning, we learned so much and were able to tell her story. We don't know her name, but we call her Sherit, which means little one. And we know from the CT scanning that she was between 4.5 and 6 years old. And we know this because her adult teeth were just about to come through. She still had her baby teeth, and her adult teeth were just about to come through. And she was very healthy right up until right before she passed on. There was a team of surgeons and other physicians and technology experts who worked on this project, and they believe that she may have died of either meningitis or possibly dysentery, which unfortunately still today, millions of people die per year from dysentery from drinking polluted water. So they were able to determine that she was very healthy, was very mobile and active right up until the time of her transition. And here are some of the CT scans, and these are like individual images, but through technology, these and processing, they were created into videos where we can see inside her bone marrow. That's how detailed CT scans are. And so you can see in the center, you see her face as it is in the mummy, but then you see her skeleton inside. And it turns out that she was healthy, but people had to be mummified relatively quickly after they passed on. And so it looks like the mummy case, the sarcophagus, wasn't quite the right size, and she was pushed in a little bit so that she would fit. And one of our volunteers on the team, one of the surgeons, his hobby was sculpting. So he created this sculpture of what Sherit might have looked like. We know she had that necklace around her neck and her hair was about that long. And so we really wanted to bring this little girl's story to life. She was a child whose parents adored her. On the outside of the mummy wrappings, you can see this resin, which would have had fragrances in it that were part of the funeral ceremony. We've also done some collaboration with the University of California at Berkeley, and their Near Eastern Studies Department, which was founded in 1894, is one of the oldest and most distinguished departments on Near Eastern studies, including Egyptology in the country. And they have a project called the Book of the Dead 3D. And Egyptian coffins are inscribed with spells and images that stand in for spells. And the whole point of these texts was to serve as a magical machine that would help to resurrect the deceased person, to help them make it into the afterlife, and to guide them safely through the next world. And where the text and the symbols are placed is really important. But in most studies of the Book of the Dead, it doesn't show the whole context. That's what the University of California at Berkeley used our sarcophagus here to show, that it's the whole story of the person and how they would make their journey to the afterlife. We also worked recently with the J. Paul Getty Museum on their Appear project, which investigates ancient panel paintings. And these are also called Fayum portraits. These are our Fayum portraits from the area of Egypt called the Fayum. There's an oasis there, and it's these are wooden panels that would have been placed on top of a mummy. So where the face is, these wooden panels would be placed during Roman periods. And so we're working with the Getty Museum on this project. Recently, an archaeologist named Walter Chris, PhD, wrote an article in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, and it was also published in Science magazine and hundreds of other magazines. And he discovered that our Senet board that you see here on the left demonstrates a crucial stage in the evolution of this board game. And this board game, it's called Senet, S-E-N-E-T, and it was very popular for hundreds of years in ancient Egypt. However, our board in particular is the first place where there's an indication that this board also served as a map for how to make your way through the Dawat, the afterlife. And there's the online article in Science. We also worked with a group from the University of California at Los Angeles and Oxford University and the Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin on something called the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. And they studied 173 objects in our museum. Now, most of the artifacts in the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum are Egyptian, but we also have artifacts from other traditions nearby, including these that are Sumerian, Akkadian, and Elamite. And among these, this is a very rare proclamation by the famous Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. Only 6 of these were created during his lifetime, and only 2 exist today, and we have one of them on display. We also have an important Neo-Babylonian medical text and a tablet listing the names of the planets. Another project with artifacts related to Egypt but not Egyptian in our collection was a recent article from scholars at the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington that presents a study of ancient Iranian stamp seals in our museum. And I'm going to show you a few of these. They're astonishing. This is a sphinx, and this figure is, they would stamp it. So it's a seal, they would stamp it. This is the size of my thumbnail. It's a very tiny seal, and you can see how intricate it is here. Here are 2 others. The one on the left is a man facing an altar, and it's a stick figure, and he is worshiping there. And on the right is a Zoroastrian fire altar. And again, these are on tiny little seals. These are about the size of a dime. And all of this research is available on our website. If you go to news, you can read more about this. We are also creating 3D models of many of our artifacts. And if you go to our website, you can find these. And when you click on these, with your cursor, you can move these objects around as if you were holding them in your hand. These are 3D models that look like they are right there. You can look inside, you can look underneath, all the way around. And we also have created 360-degree tours of each of the galleries in the museum, of the tomb that's under the museum, and of other parts of Rosicrucian Park. And all of these are available on the website. Now we're going to explore a few of the artifacts in the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum. And it's helpful to keep in mind how the ancient Egyptians viewed their deities. This is a statue of Sekhmet in our collection. And this is not the little statue that I showed you earlier, RC number 1. This statue is almost as tall as I am. And she was one that was created by Amenhotep III, the pharaoh, to help heal him. Sekhmet is the goddess of healing and the goddess of war. Often, ancient Egyptian deities would contain their opposites. And these statues and the other artifacts that you see, these were so real and personal to the ancient Egyptians. Today, we might walk in a museum and say, oh, that's an interesting statue, or look at that sarcophagus, not thinking, my gosh, that sarcophagus is a magical chamber to help someone make it to their afterlife. Or when the ancient Egyptians smelled incense, they believed it was the fragrance of the deity in their midst. They thought the deity was nearby. They viewed smoke as being of both this world and the spiritual world. So when they would see smoke, it helped to connect them with other planes of existence. Sound was also important to them. And these are items called sistrum. And they're typically called rattles, but the sound they really make is shh, 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 shh. That's the sound when you shake these. And they are often with the head of Hathor, the cow goddess. And on the left, these are artifacts are all in our museum. On the left are the, you can see Hathor's face. And there would have been these rods going through there so that the sistrum could be played and made this sound. And Hathor was the goddess of love and beauty and joy and dance. And she also was the deity that welcomed people to the next life, to a place called the Field of Reeds, R-E-E-D-S, the Field of Reeds. And the sound that the sistrum makes is what it would sound like if the cow goddess was rustling through the reeds near you. So I invite you just to think for a moment of how you view your deity, whoever or whatever you worship. Just close your eyes for a moment. And imagine if you could sense the presence of the divine approaching you. Would there be a fragrance associated with that? Would you hear the divine approaching you? Would a substance like smoke or flames that are both of this world and of the non-material world help you to connect with the deity that you may worship. And when you're ready, open your eyes. This is an artifact in the museum that is a mirror. And you can see Hathor, that's her face, the cow-headed deity of joy and dance and music. And this would have been shine, so it was as reflective as a mirror is today. And the name for a mirror in ancient Egyptian was Ankh, A-N-K-H. And the word for everlasting life is Ankh, A-N-K-H. And some people say that when mirrors are made in the shape of an Ankh, an Ankh is a cross with a loop on the top, that was the ancient Egyptians making a pun, because Egyptians liked puns. So it'd be like, oh, that's an Ankh, Ankh. Last year, I was meditating on this idea, and I thought, what if that wasn't what they meant at all? But instead, when you have the mirror called Ankh, and you have the shape of the Ankh, which means everlasting life, and almost always it would have the face of a deity like Hathor here, or the goddess Isis. What if it is like in the Rosicrucian, like it's described in the Rosicrucian tradition, that it is the deity, it is life itself reflecting on itself? What if it is the goddess or the god or the divine reflecting on itself in our reflection by looking at us? Often what we see in ancient Egypt has more than one meaning. The Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum has many important artifacts related with pharaohs. However, the greatest strength of our collection is daily objects and daily life, and just how the everyday Egyptian lived. Does anyone know what these figures are? Have any of you seen these before? These are artifacts in the museum. Some of you are familiar. These are headrests. And the Egyptians would put their neck over the loop part, and they would sleep that way. And they often wore wigs and sometimes hair extensions. These are items in the museum. That's a hair extension, like we have hair extensions today, and a comb and a hairpin. And so they would sleep with their neck supported by a neck rest like this. And you might think, okay, everything's symbolic and has another meaning, but really, I mean, a pillow, a headrest, what other meaning could there be to that? So stay tuned, because I'm going to share that with you, but not quite yet. So we also talked about this Senet game. And this may look like a game board where you just play a game, but it's actually a description to help you make your journey through the tests and trials on your way to the afterlife, called the Dawat, which is spelled either D-U-A-T or D-W-A-T. And again, it's our Senet game that is the first representation that shows that mystical meaning. And we recreated the Senet game in life size at Rosicrucian Park. And we oriented it so that when you win this game, you step off this board to the left, and that faces due east. And this is the place where the sun is reborn every morning. It's where life is regenerated. And that was the goal of playing the Senet game. Now, I mentioned earlier that Thoth represents the ancient Egyptian mysteries. He was the god of the scribes, the keeper of the mysteries. If the ancient Egyptians wrote something down, it made it true and everlasting. And this is why when people came later, they would deface a statue or they would destroy things so that that person wouldn't live on in eternity. So here we have Thoth on the right, and this is a coffin fragment, and he's writing down how this person on the left did in their life. In the final judgment, everyone was asked questions, and their heart was weighed against the feather of truth, the feather of Mot. And if your heart was heavy, you didn't get to go on to the afterlife. So Thoth is recording everything that this person did in their life. And as I said, sometimes he is in the form of a man with an ibis head, and sometimes as a baboon. And I'll show you the baboon in a minute. Here are some ibis mummies that we have. And the ibis birds on the side, they're mummified inside that linen. And in the center, that is gold leaf over a sarcophagus for an ibis bird. And this is a small statue of Thoth as the baboon. And scribes would sit this way when they wrote in ancient Egypt. And this was an incense burner. You can see the hole underneath. So imagine Thoth before you with the smoke from the incense floating up around his statue. Now, to find any of these objects that I've just described, when you go to either Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum.org, or because all of those words are hard to spell, we shorten it also to just EgyptianMuseum.org. If you go there, at the top of the page, it says collection, and that's the collection of artifacts, and then you can search the collection for any of these artifacts you may want to learn more about. So again, Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum.org or EgyptianMuseum.org. In the 1920s, the Rosicrucian Order sponsored excavations by the Egypt Exploration Society that were conducted in the city of the Pharaoh Akhnaton, who's shown here, and his city was called Akhetaton. His name's Akhenaten, and his city was Akhetaton. And in exchange for our support, we received some artifacts from this expedition. And we have a gallery dedicated to Akhenaten and the city that he created out in the desert. Akhenaten, well, everybody believed that the deities, like when you see Sekhmet and Isis and Horus and all these different deities, that they were aspects of an unknowable deity. And they were called Netcher, N-T-R, but pronounced Netcher. And this is like the true essence of what it is they were representing. So for example, Sekhmet, the true essence would be like a lioness who is both strong in warfare and a healer, or Horus, who can see from the heights. Well, Akhenaten came from a school that believed that this unknowable deity behind all those aspects was, we could never know it, and he called it the Aton, A-T-O-N. Akhenaten believed that the only symbol powerful enough to symbolize this unknowable deity was the sun. And so he shifted the focus from these different Netcher, these different attributes of the unknowable deity, he shifted the focus to just the deity that he called the Aton. And this is a ring that belonged to Akhenaten before, or early in his reign. So this ring was probably given to someone in thanks for their exceptional service. But absolutely, Akhenaten, the pharaoh in ancient Egypt, held this ring. And this ring is in our museum. And then he reigned for 17 years. And later in his reign, he changed his name, which was originally Amenhotep IV, meaning that he worshiped the god Amun. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning the effective one for the Aton. So he wanted to make it very clear that he worshiped this unknowable deity. The sun was the only symbol powerful enough to represent that deity, but it wasn't, the sun is not the deity. There's something that exists beyond that. So he changed his name to Akhenaten. And he lived from the year 1380 to 1336 BCE. And he had several wives, which was expected at that time. And his most famous wife is Nefertiti. And together, Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters. So Akhenaten wanted to make such a strong statement about his deity that he chose a place out in the desert that had never been dedicated to any other deity and made this the sacred place for the new worship center. And the sacred story says that he was sailing down the Nile and he looked over and he saw in the hills the mountains, and then there was this little dip in the mountains, and the sun was coming up right in the middle of that dip. And this is the hieroglyph for what his city would be named. Akhet is the word for horizon. And again, give it a deeper meaning, because it's not just like, oh, there's a line over there, that's the horizon. This is the place where the sun reappears after journeying through the underworld. That's how powerful the horizon is. So then in the center is a circle, which is the symbol for the Aton and for sun. So this hieroglyph shows that this is Akhetaton, that this is the horizon of the Aton. And this was the view that he saw going down the Nile. The sun actually rises between that little dip. Here you can see the dip and the hieroglyph for Akhetaton, the city that Akhenaten created out in the desert for the worship of the Aton. Within 4 years, it's estimated that 30,000 people were living in this beautiful city. And again, this is the place where the horizon is the place where we're all reborn each morning through the life-giving rays of the sun. So when you see a hieroglyph, it has such deep meaning. It's not, oh, okay, there's a circle and another thing. This speaks volumes. Today, this city is typically called Amarna, and that's named after a tribe, a Bedouin tribe that lived there later. But during the time of Akhenaten, this was a beautiful, shining city in the desert sun. It was painted in brilliant colors and covered with alabaster. And even today, and like if you go to Egypt today, you can buy lamps made of alabaster, and they're lamp shades, and the glow is otherworldly. You cannot believe how beautiful it is when light shines through alabaster. And this city was alabaster and painted, and it included a lot of natural scenes from nature, because nature was very important in this tradition. So here we have the hieroglyph, Akhenaten, and Akhetaton actually manifesting with the sunrise. After Akhenaten's death, his city was destroyed. And now a few areas have been built in just a small manner. There aren't huge structures that have been rebuilt. But this was the Sun Temple. These two pillars have been re-erected, and you can see that they are aligned so that that dip is right in the center of where their temple faced. This is an artifact in our museum of Akhenaten worshiping the Aton. So this is the pharaoh, this devout person worshiping his deity. And we've seen this image before. Again, this is in our collection. The Aton is giving him life through his breath. Again, there's that Ankh sign. See that those are the hands of the Aton. It's the bigger image shows the sun with the rays, and at the end of the rays are hands holding the Aton symbol, giving him life. And here he's holding an Ankh sign in one hand, and in the other hand, he has an incense burner exactly like the one that we have in our collection. Ours is from a different location. It's not from his city, but as you can see with the head of Horus there, so he would have invoked the presence of the divine. He would have created that ambiance, that atmosphere to attune with the God of his heart, the fragrance of the divine in his presence, the smoke, creating that opening between this world and the next world. And there is the incense burner from our collection. There would be a little cup on the hand at the end, and the incense was in the cup in the middle. That's the pharaoh in the middle. And you would have taken tweezers and put it in the cup on the hand where there was charcoal. And so this was, again, extending the fragrance and the smoke of the incense as part of a ritual. So we've been talking about this symbol of Akhetaton. And I mentioned before that I would make a case that there is a connection with Egyptian pillows or headrests with having more than one meaning. So imagine if your head rested on these crescents. The ancient Egyptian word for headrest is related to the word for to awaken. And the shape of most Egyptian headrests echoes this form that you see here for the hieroglyph for horizon, the Akhet, where the sun is reborn each morning. So we can see how resting the head on top of a headrest resembles the hieroglyph for the place, Akhetaton, with the location of the birth of the sun on the horizon. So using the headrest, one could hope to magically awaken each morning while they're alive, and then eternally awaken after their transition. And headrests like this have been found in many tomb treasures. This could also connect the person who is sleeping with the Aton, which is symbolized by the circle. So our head becomes the circle on the headrest. Again, when we approach ancient cultures, which in some ways are so much more profound than we think they are, and in some cases even than our own general traditions are, we can see that there's meaning there that we may have missed because we didn't understand the full context of how these ancient people lived and worshiped. Now, as I mentioned, in the city of Akhetaton, the buildings were all painted with brilliant colors, covered with alabaster, and it would be lit through the walls. So the light would be real either way, either from the sun outside or from the light inside going out. And art was very important to life in this city. Now, every artifact that I have shown you has been from our collection. These three are not, but everything else is from the collection of the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum. These are from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and they are the painted floors from the palace in Akhetaton. You can see the rich colors and the value of nature. Nature was a really important component of the worship of the Aton during this period. And this is an artifact from our collection. Over to the left, you see the Aton, the sun, with the hands, with the rays with the hands at the end. And these are ibexes. It's hard to see them. I blew it up and it's not very clear because I made the image so large. These animals are almost extinct now, but they were especially important and were believed to be especially blessed because of their almost constant contact with the Aton. So this relief was on a building at Akhetaton, and now it's in our collection. This is also in our collection. It's a beautiful little grape cluster, and faux grapes were used to decorate windowsills so that people could always feel as if they were in a garden. This is a model in the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum that was built in 1966. And we have a few dioramas and models that we've purposely chosen to keep, even though everything else has been much more modernized, because a lot of people remember these and feel very nostalgic about them. And this is a model of what an estate would have looked like at the city that Akhenaten created out in the desert. I mentioned that Nefertiti and Akhenaten had 6 daughters, and Akhenaten had a son by another wife, and his name was originally, I have to get it right. Well, it's King Tut. We know him as Tutankhamun, but he was originally named Tutankhaten. But he was a boy when he became the pharaoh, and others took control and reestablished the older traditions that were worshipped, and King Tut changed his name. So, or they changed his name for King Tut. But this is a partial bust of King Tut in our museum. This is a statue. So that concludes the part about the city that Akhenaten built out in the desert, his sacred Akhetaton. One of the most important artifacts in the museum is this statue of Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra. There were 7 Cleopatras. She was the last and the most famous one. And there are only 7 of these statues that still exist in the world. And she has traveled as part of the British Museum's exhibit on Cleopatra. She's been to London and Rome and New York and Chicago. This is a really important artifact. She's maybe 2/3 size of how tall I am. So she's full size, but on the small side. And the way she's standing here is she is standing in a very traditional Egyptian style, which is meant to remind whoever's looking at her of the many generations that Cleopatra's family ruled Egypt. For almost 300, yes, for 300 years, there were the Ptolemies, who were not Egyptian, ruled Egypt. But here is Cleopatra. She dressed like an Egyptian. She spoke Egyptian. She also spoke, I think it was 11 other languages. And she also has her features in Roman, because at this time, Egypt was a protectorate of Rome, which means that Rome called all the shots. She was, excuse me, she was the pharaoh eventually after when her father died. She and her brother were made co-rulers, but then her brother was no longer a co-ruler. And so she is embracing the Egyptian tradition. Now Julius Caesar went to Egypt to find out what was going on down there, because this was their protectorate, and this brother and sister are having this big fight, and her brother had her exiled. And so when Julius Caesar arrived, the sacred story says that Cleopatra couldn't just walk in and say, Julius Caesar, I need your help. So she had herself rolled in a carpet. The carpet was delivered to Caesar, and as the carpet was unfurled, he saw this beautiful woman, Cleopatra. And they established a relationship, and he had a son by her named Caesarion. And then Caesar went back to Rome and was murdered. So later, Mark Antony went to Egypt, again, to see what was going on down there. And Mark Antony fell in love with Cleopatra. They had several children together. He dressed as an Egyptian. He married Cleopatra. And then Octavian, who was ruling in Rome, declared war on them, and Mark Antony lost the battle, and Cleopatra knew that she was going to be captured, and so she killed herself rather than being captured. And that was the end of the dynasties of pharaohs. So this is a really important statue of Cleopatra, and she has the triple snakes on her crown, which identify her. She also has what are called the rings of Venus around her neck, and Venus was the goddess of beauty, the Roman goddess of beauty, and this was to show that she was, like, being a little full-figured was definitely a sign of beauty and health, because a lot of people didn't have enough food to be able to be full-figured. And she is wearing clothes, but it's the very finest linen. The more fine the linen, the more transparent it is. So that was to signify that she had the best linen, the most expensive linen possible. And I mentioned that we've created these 3D models. If you go to our website and you can go to these, it's as if you can just walk around Cleopatra and see her. And quickly, we're going to end our tour of the museum with a visit to the tomb. So this tomb is most like one of a man named Khunemhotep in the Beni Hassan region of ancient Egypt. And again, Ralph Lewis took this team to Egypt and then recreated the best features of this tomb. This is the sky goddess Nut, who is in the tomb, and her arms and her feet reach across the sky. She's the goddess of the sky, protecting everything on earth. And where you see the stars there, this is The other world, the Duat, the afterworld, exists beyond what we can see. So the stars are like on Newt's skin, and the afterworld is beyond that. And here's a close-up of our beautiful goddess Nut, who keeps a watch over all of us. Every night she swallows the moon and gives birth to the sun, and it goes through that beautiful journey of the afterlife through the Duat, where it's reborn in the morning. And over to the left is the tomb owner, Khnumhotep. He's going before the 42 gods and goddesses, and he's declaring that he has led a good life. And here are more of them, which leads over to the right to the final judgment scene. And there again, you have the scales of justice. Khnumhotep is on the left. Anubis is the conductor of the mysteries. He's holding his hand. And look what's in his other hand, the Ankh, everlasting life. He's trying to help Khnumhotep make it to paradise, to the field of reeds, to the Duat, where everything exists beyond time and space. So Khnumhotep's heart is in that jar on the left, and it's being weighed against the feather of truth on the right. And sure enough, there is Thoth recording everything. And in every tomb, these scales are balanced. Well, of course, you want this to be what happens in your afterlife, but you could see there's a double of Anubis here. He's tipping the scale. Just in case the tomb owner may have made a few mistakes in his life, he's like, okay, all right, maybe you caused someone to weep. Maybe you told a few untruths. So he's helping the person so that the scales are balanced. And Khnumhotep succeeds. Over to the right, he's being led by Horus, the falcon-headed god, who again has the Ankh in his hand. Now you see that Khnumhotep's face has been defaced. That is because this tomb had been robbed, and people in ancient times would come in and they'd hit the walls looking for hidden chambers, looking to see if there were treasures hidden behind there. So we recreated it just like it was in the original. So to conclude, here is something that I think the ancients would appreciate about the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum with their worship of the sun. A couple of years ago, Rosicrucian Park achieved net zero carbon status, meaning that we produce all of our own energy. We made sure everything was as energy efficient as possible, and we installed solar panels on our buildings. This is the roof of the museum. And this is the roof of the Grand Temple next to our labyrinth. And I'm just imagining Akhenaten, who attuned so much with the energy of the sun, and the other ancient Egyptians appreciating that we could have a sustainable use of resources by working with the life-giving power of the sun. So on that note, we'll conclude our virtual tour of the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum.